In the mid-1960s, Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the best-known civil rights activists in the United States. She became a public figure in midlife, seemingly overnight, thanks to her voting rights work in Mississippi with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. One of her best-known moments came in 1964. During a push to seat an alternative Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention, Hamer told the DNC's Credentials Committee about the price she and other activists had already paid for their work.
10 of us was traveling by the Continental Trailway bus, and somebody screamed from the car that the fire workers was in and said, "Get that one there." I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room, and it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman, and he said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead." I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush.
Just a few years later, though, Hamer's fame and influence were on the wane. By the time she passed away in 1977, she'd been largely marginalized by many of her former compatriots. It is a complicated story involving gender, class, and strategic debates inside the civil rights movement. And it's told in vivid detail in the new book, Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, by the historian Kate Clifford Larson, who joins me now. Kate, good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
Can you start off by describing, in as much detail as you want, the world that Hamer inhabited before she became a public figure?
She was a Mississippi sharecropper with her husband and children in Ruleville, Mississippi in Sunflower County. Extreme poverty, a life that was hemmed in by tremendous segregation and discrimination. She had no access to voting. She was just living the life that her parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had lived, and all of her relatives lived there. And so she just was one of millions at the time when she came on the scene during the early 1960s.
It's a bit of an overstatement, I know, but when I read your book, which is fascinating and really moving and very sad for me, it seemed like she went almost overnight from being, as you said, one of millions living in these horrible conditions to someone who was a civil rights icon and who was leading a movement. Talk viewers and me through what happened in her life to affect that change so quickly.
There were a couple of actually seminal moments that I think that just catapulted her into the public eye and into the movement. One was not only the poverty and the discrimination and the frustrations that she lived with every day, but in 1961, when she was 44 years old, she was sterilized without her consent. And it took away a part of her, and it took her a long time to recover physically and intellectually and emotionally. And once I look at it as she was sort of reborn after that, and she was determined to make a change, that she was going to become the change that she wanted to see in the community, in the South, in the world. And that really started on her path of wanting to get involved in the civil rights movement.
She was sterilized without her consent, had a hysterectomy performed by a white doctor who was connected with the family that she worked for. And I learned from your book that that is something that was referred to as a Mississippi appendectomy because it happened so frequently. And this happened after she and her husband had been trying and failing to have a child for years. So
that's right.
So it seems to me that after that tragedy occurred, she began working to register voters, working with SNCC to get black voters registered in Mississippi, which obviously was very important for her career in the movement. But there was also this absolutely horrific episode where she and some of her compatriots were detained and then brutalized by police in, I think, Winona, I think that's how you pronounce it, Winona, Mississippi. Right. Can you describe, you describe it in great detail in the book, and it is almost unreadable because what happened to them was so awful. But Can you offer a description that does justice to the horror of what they went through?
Right. They were on a bus coming back from South Carolina where they had been involved in a class to learn how to teach people to register to vote and also to teach them the Constitution and things like that because they had to pass literacy tests. And the police stopped them on the bus in Winona, Mississippi, not too far from where she lived, and pulled them into the jail. And one by one, she and her colleagues were brutally beaten. And they took, the women in particular were beaten incredibly, horribly. And Hamer herself was actually raped at that time too. She survived, clinging to her faith and her belief that she needed to make a difference. And it was another turning point in her life. She survived that beating, and she came out of it basically saying, you know, what more can they do to me? I am just going to keep doing this until they kill me because we need to make a change in this world.
As you describe what she went through, I want to come out of that and I want to pull up a picture of Hamer at what I think was sort of the apex of her career, when she was well physically, surrounded by friends and family. That's her husband in the background behind her. You mentioned, as you described that ordeal she went through in Winona, Mississippi, you mentioned the role that faith played. And another really interesting theme for me in your book is the double-edged sword that religious faith can be when it comes to either challenging or endorsing the continuation of a morally unacceptable status quo. Can you run through a little bit what religion meant to Hamer, and when she was, in some situations, she was very critical of organized religion and the way the black clergy was approaching the civil rights movement. Yet it also gave her a great deal of strength as she did her work. Can you describe that a little bit?
Sure. So for Hamer, her faith was very personal. It wasn't rooted in a church structure, a building, or in any one minister. It was a deep and profound faith and an understanding of the Bible and what she perceived as God's love for her. So it gave her resilience and strength. It helped her look at the world and make sense of it, even at times when there was no making sense of it. And she was able to use that faith and look at the people that hated her and wanted to beat her and beat her down and say, I still love you, in a concept that I can't understand, but she would say that. Yeah, but that she was going to keep moving on because she knew that the right thing to do was to be equal, and she was going to push for that. And she believed if they were people of faith, they would see that too. And some people were transformed by that powerful faith that she had, because people couldn't get their head around it. Like, how can you be so passive and not fight and just say, you know, it's going to work, God is with us? It's hard to see it.
Yeah, it is. I mentioned her criticism of quietist black clergy. You describe in the book briefly, but it's a devastating anecdote, her heading up to Boston to meet with Cardinal Richard Cushing to try to enlist his help, and he just brushed her off, right?
He just brushed her off. They thought because he was friends with the Kennedy family that he would be supportive of their efforts to push the Democratic Party further into voting for voting rights and things like that. And he walked up to them and just dismissed them, said, you know, my president, John F. Kennedy, is dead. I don't need to talk to you. And he just walked away. Yeah.
Hamer ran for Congress in 1964 as part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a group that was attempting to reclaim the Democratic Party in Mississippi for people who were not white supremacist voters. We have a picture, a campaign picture from that run. When she didn't win, she ended up challenging the result, basically saying the election had been unconstitutional because black voters had been disenfranchised systematically, and that challenge failed. As you look back as her biographer at that campaign, do you think of it as a success or not?
when you look at the continuum of events that happened as a result of her running for Congress and losing, it was a success because she was able to go to the United States Congress and challenge the Mississippi representatives that were elected by the white population. She and two of her colleagues were the first Black women ever to seat in Congress. It had never happened before in the history of the United States. And people began to take notice. And President Johnson paid attention. He signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act that made it illegal to do all of the things that Mississippi was doing to disfranchise Black voters. And then hundreds of thousands of Black people could vote, and it changed the fabric and the nature of politics in the South as a result of it.
I should mention, because I haven't brought this up yet, and it's such an important detail, that the comments we heard her giving at the start of this discussion, those are comments that LBJ the year before actually decided to preempt because he didn't like what she was putting on the table about the reality of the South and Southern Democrats. So he held this impromptu press conference so that people couldn't hear Fannie Lou Hamer speak, which is a real testament to how important she was in that moment and around that time.
Right.
Hamer, in addition to everything we've talked about, she helped lead the March for Fear in 1966. She was a member of the first integrated Mississippi delegation in 68. She helped found the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. But when I read your book, one of my big takeaways is not just that she came on the scene suddenly, but that she had this drastic and almost equally precipitous decline in her career. I don't want to put words in your mouth. You might not describe it that way. But when things started to go poorly for Fannie Lou Hamer, what was responsible?
Partly it was her health. I mean, she suffered greatly from the injuries from the beating, and she had kidney issues and eye problems. So her health was a constant problem. And then I think the movement changed in the 1960s. There were parts of it that became much more radical, and those people that had been close to her rejected her, that she was too old and not educated enough. She wasn't sophisticated enough, so they rejected her and they moved on to pursue their goals in the movement. And other people aged out. Other people decided to go to graduate school and pursue other things. So her base of support earlier in the movement was dissipating and moving away. She still was very powerful in Mississippi and made a huge difference for her neighbors and Mississippians, but it did diminish because she didn't have the clout that she had once had. In the women's movement, she became a little bit more powerful, but she was very conservative. So some of the feminists, had a hard time with her.
Hold that thought for 1 second. I want to talk about her role in the women's movement and her heterogeneity in that movement. But one of the things that I will always remember about your book years from now is the extent to which, you mentioned this a moment ago, class and gender played a role in her being pushed aside. There were a lot of well-known figures in the civil rights movement who thought that she just aesthetically, she wasn't the right voice, right? She was too coarse, too uneducated. She didn't sound sophisticated. How important was that classist element to her being shunted to the side?
It was huge because she had to battle it for so long. And it's surprising that she still could rise to the top, which is a testament to her great skill as an orator, as a leader. But it wore her down, because people just looked the other way because she wasn't as attractive as younger activists. And as you said, she wasn't as well educated. Her diction was not perfect. Her message was perfect. But the elite leaders just wanted her to step aside, and they felt that they had a better way of saying it and pushing things forward. And she just, it was very hurtful for her, very hurtful.
You talked about her work in the women's movement and her conservatism. You have a quote, which I didn't think to get ready, but a quote from her talking about her opposition not only to abortion, but to birth control. And this seems to be driven from the quote by, again, her deep Christian faith, right? She just thought it was not right to not allow life to come forth. How did other women political leaders, how did they grapple with her social conservatism?
A lot of them were very resentful, and they didn't like that her voice was so powerful. They were struggling to make a difference and to change laws, and she was anti-abortion. And the birth control thing, I think she moderated on eventually, but she lived in a community where they used children as a weapon against women, that they would take the children away, or the forced sterilization of Black women in particular.
She lost a daughter at a young age, right?
Yeah, that's right. A daughter, the access to health care, it just was an issue for her. And she felt that any child born could be loved and taken care of. And so she couldn't wrap her head around the idea that someone would have an abortion. She just couldn't accept it.
We've got just under 2 minutes left. I want to let you close by talking a bit about her relationship with her husband, which seems to me to be another area in which you could point to some conservatism, at least when it comes to traditional gender roles and what women are expected to put up with from men. Just briefly, in a minute and a half, talk about her husband and how he helped her and how he maybe hurt her.
Pap Hamer was a really, people describe him as a great man and a great guy, but they had a traditional marriage where he was the man of the house, and what he said was what they did. However, when she entered the movement, he did step aside and let her take the lead and do what she felt she needed to do, and he stayed home with their daughters and took care of them and raised them. But he also, as some of the interviewees that I talked to for the book said, he stepped out on her. He had affairs. He had children with other women. And so, but she loved him. They loved each other. They stayed together. They were committed to each other. So it's a relationship I don't completely understand, but it worked for the two of them. And she stayed with him, and that was her life, and that's what she wanted.
That's another thing I really appreciated about your book. You addressed the complexity of this relationship and didn't sort of flinch from describing the bad things he did, while also noting that there's this fundamental inscrutability whenever it comes to sizing up any pairing. The book is a really compelling and educative and, again, sad read. Highly recommended. Kate Clifford Larson, thank you for being here to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.